"You're nobody," the officer said, and for a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to agree. A few quiet chuckles drifted through the gallery. Someone shook their head. Someone else smirked. And seated alone near the back of the courtroom, a tall black man in a charcoal gray suit simply looked forward and said nothing. His name was Marcus Reed, but nobody in that room seemed interested in learning it. The courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, carried the familiar weight of authority. The polished wooden benches reflected the pale glow of overhead lights. The seal of justice hung above the judge's bench. Attorneys shuffled papers. Reporters checked their notebooks. Spectators leaned forward, hungry for another ordinary day of courtroom drama. Yet something about that morning felt different, as though the air itself were holding its breath. Marcus sat with calm shoulders and steady eyes. No lawyer sat beside him. No assistant followed him. No badge was visible. To everyone watching, he appeared to be just another man who had wandered into a place where powerful people made important decisions. Officer Derek Vaughn certainly saw him that way. Vaughn stood near the front of the room in his crisp uniform, wearing the kind of confidence that came from years of never being challenged. He noticed Marcus sitting quietly by himself and immediately decided what kind of man he must be. The judgment came easily. It always had. When Marcus approached a side table reserved for approved observers, Vaughn stepped forward and blocked his path. "That seat isn't for people like you," he said loudly enough for nearby spectators to hear. Several heads turned. The room's attention shifted. Marcus paused but remained composed. "I'm here on official business," he replied calmly. Vaughn laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not an uncertain one. It was the laugh of someone completely convinced he was right. "Official business," he repeated. "You expect anyone here to believe that?" A few more chuckles followed. Marcus glanced briefly toward the judge's bench, which remained empty for the moment. Then he looked back at Vaughn. His expression never changed. That seemed to irritate the officer even more. People expect anger. They expect arguments. They expect a reaction. Marcus gave none. The silence only made Vaughn push harder. "You know what your problem is?" Vaughn asked. "You walk in here acting like you belong." The words hung in the room. Some people looked away. Others watched with growing curiosity. Marcus simply folded his hands in front of him. He could have ended the conversation with a single sentence. He could have explained exactly who he was. He could have shown the credential resting quietly inside his jacket. But he didn't. Instead, he waited. Across the courtroom, an elderly court clerk glanced toward Marcus and frowned slightly, as if she recognized something others did not. Near the entrance, a reporter lowered her phone and stared a little longer than before. And somewhere beyond the heavy wooden doors, footsteps echoed through the hallway as the judge prepared to enter. Still, Marcus remained silent. Because sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the one speaking. Sometimes it is the one who already knows how the story ends. The heavy courtroom doors opened, and the low murmur of conversation faded almost instantly. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades commanding respect without ever raising her voice. Everyone rose. Chairs shifted across the polished floor. Papers rustled. Then silence settled over the room once again. Marcus Reed remained composed as he took his seat. From the outside, he looked unremarkable. No expensive watch. No flashy briefcase. No attempt to draw attention to himself. Yet there was something unusual about the way he observed the room. His eyes moved carefully from one face to another, noticing details most people ignored. He noticed which attorneys avoided looking at Officer Derek Vaughn. He noticed which reporters seemed unusually interested in the officer's testimony. Most importantly, he noticed the tension hidden beneath the courtroom's polished surface. Judge Whitmore reviewed several documents before glancing toward the gallery. Her gaze briefly paused on Marcus. Only for a second. Then she continued with the morning proceedings. To everyone else, the moment seemed insignificant. Marcus knew better. Meanwhile, Derek Vaughn stood near the prosecution table with growing irritation. Something about Marcus bothered him. Perhaps it was the calmness. Perhaps it was the confidence. Or perhaps it was the uncomfortable feeling that the man sitting quietly in the back knew more than he should. Whatever the reason, Derek could not leave it alone. As witness testimony began, he continued casting occasional glances toward Marcus. Each time he looked, Marcus appeared exactly the same. Patient. Focused. Unmoved. The officer finally leaned toward another deputy and muttered something under his breath. The deputy laughed quietly. A few spectators exchanged amused looks. Marcus ignored them all. The trial itself involved allegations of misconduct inside a city department, but the details seemed almost secondary to the strange atmosphere developing inside the room. It was as though two entirely different stories were unfolding at the same time. One story was visible to everyone. The other remained hidden beneath the surface. As the morning continued, a young reporter named Sarah Bennett sat 3 rows behind Marcus. She had covered courthouse proceedings for nearly 5 years. Experience had taught her to trust instinct. And her instinct told her the quiet man in the charcoal suit was not who people assumed he was. She noticed something peculiar. Marcus never appeared surprised by anything that was said. Every witness statement. Every legal argument. Every piece of testimony. It was almost as if he had already heard it before. Sarah opened her notebook and wrote a simple question near the top of the page. Who is Marcus Reed? At nearly the same moment, Judge Whitmore received a sealed folder from her court clerk. The judge accepted it without comment. Her expression remained neutral as she opened it. She read the first page. Then the second. For the briefest moment, her eyes narrowed. Not in confusion. In recognition. She closed the folder carefully and placed it beside her bench. Nobody seemed to notice except Marcus. Across the room, their eyes met for less than a heartbeat. No words were exchanged. No gestures were made. Yet something passed silently between them. And while Officer Derek Vaughn continued believing he controlled the room, events had already begun moving in a direction he could not see. The real story was only beginning to reveal itself. The morning session moved forward, but the attention of the room no longer rested entirely on the case being argued before Judge Eleanor Whitmore. Curiosity had begun spreading through the courtroom like an invisible current. People continued listening to testimony, yet more and more eyes drifted toward Marcus Reed. He remained exactly where he had been all morning, seated quietly near the back, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. To most people, silence looked like weakness. To Marcus, silence was simply patience. Officer Derek Vaughn, however, interpreted it differently. The longer Marcus remained calm, the more irritated he became. Some people are uncomfortable around confidence they cannot explain, and Marcus carried that kind of confidence without saying a word. During a brief pause between witnesses, Derek stepped away from the front of the courtroom and walked directly toward him. Conversations softened. Reporters looked up from their notes. Even spectators who had been checking their phones suddenly paid attention. Derek stopped a few feet from Marcus and folded his arms. You still have not explained why you are here, he said. Marcus looked up calmly. I am here because I have a right to be here. Derek smirked. That is not an answer. Marcus said nothing further. The officer glanced around as if inviting the room to join him in amusement. A few people exchanged uncertain smiles. Others simply watched. Funny, Derek continued. Most people answer questions when they are asked. Marcus held his gaze. Most people ask the right questions. The response drew a few surprised looks. Sarah Bennett nearly dropped her pen. The answer had not been aggressive. It had not been disrespectful. Yet somehow Marcus had shifted the balance of the conversation without raising his voice. Derek felt it immediately. His smile faded. You think you are smarter than everyone else in this room? Marcus shook his head. No, sir. Then maybe you should start acting like you belong here. The words lingered in the air. Marcus slowly looked around the courtroom. The polished wood. The state flags. The rows of benches. The seal above the judge's bench. Then he returned his attention to Derek. I do belong here. For the first time all morning, uncertainty flickered across a few faces. The confidence in Marcus's voice did not sound rehearsed. It sounded factual. As if he knew something nobody else knew. Across the room, Judge Whitmore observed the exchange without interruption. Beside her sat the sealed folder delivered earlier that morning. She had not opened it again, but her eyes occasionally drifted toward it. Meanwhile, Sarah continued taking notes. The deeper she looked into the situation, the stranger it became. Every instinct told her Marcus was not simply an observer. There was a reason he had come to court alone. There was a reason he appeared completely unconcerned by the attention surrounding him. And there was definitely a reason the judge seemed aware of something nobody else understood. Derek finally leaned closer and lowered his voice. Let me give you some advice. Whatever game you are playing, it is about to end. Marcus met his stare without hesitation. Maybe, he replied quietly. Or maybe it is just getting started. A silence followed. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of anticipation. Because somewhere beneath the routine rhythm of the courtroom, unseen pieces were already moving into place, and before the day was over, everyone in that room would discover that the man they had underestimated was the one person they should have been paying attention to all along. The tension that had been quietly building throughout the morning finally reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. What had started as a few comments and suspicious glances had now become the center of attention inside the courtroom. Officer Derek Vaughn was no longer interested in the case being argued before Judge Eleanor Whitmore. His focus had narrowed entirely to Marcus Reed. Every calm response Marcus gave seemed to make the officer more determined to challenge him. The spectators sensed it. The attorneys sensed it. Even the court staff exchanged uneasy looks as Derek stepped forward once again. This time he did not stop a few feet away. He walked directly to Marcus and extended his hand. Let me see some identification, he said. The request echoed through the room. Several heads turned immediately. Marcus looked up at him. Why? He asked calmly. Derek smiled. Because I am asking. The answer drew a few nervous laughs from the gallery. Marcus remained seated. I have not disrupted the proceedings. That is not the point, Derek replied. You have spent all morning sitting here acting like you are part of something important. Marcus studied him quietly. Then he reached inside his jacket. For a brief moment the room seemed to stop breathing. Derek appeared satisfied, convinced he had finally forced the mysterious observer into a corner. Marcus removed a simple leather wallet and handed it over without resistance. Derek accepted it immediately. He opened it and began examining its contents. A driver's license. Several cards. A few folded papers. Nothing that seemed remarkable. His expression grew increasingly confident. That is what I thought, he said loudly enough for nearby spectators to hear. Just another man pretending to be more important than he is. A few people nodded. Others appeared uncertain. Sarah Bennett watched closely from her seat, writing every detail into her notebook. Something about the situation felt wrong. Marcus was too calm. Much too calm. Most people would have become defensive. Most people would have demanded their property back. Marcus simply waited. Derek continued searching through the wallet. Then he noticed a second compartment hidden behind a fold. His hand paused. The room remained silent. Slowly he removed a small identification holder. He stared at it for a moment. Then a smirk appeared. Interesting, he said. Very interesting. He held it up between two fingers. You expect people to believe this? Marcus did not answer. Derek looked toward the spectators. Apparently our friend here thinks carrying a fancy card makes him important. More laughter followed. Yet this time the reaction was weaker. Less certain. Judge Whitmore finally raised her eyes from the documents on her bench. Her expression remained controlled, but her attention was now fully focused on the exchange. Derek glanced toward her. "Your Honor, I think we have a situation." The courtroom grew still. Sarah noticed the sealed folder beside the judge. She noticed the way the clerk suddenly straightened in her chair. She noticed the way Marcus looked neither worried nor surprised. In fact, he looked as though he had been expecting this exact moment from the beginning. Derek turned the identification holder around and stared at it again. His confidence returned. "There is no way this is real," he announced. Absolutely no way. Yet despite his certainty, there was something new in his voice. Something small but unmistakable. Doubt. And for the first time all day, Marcus allowed the faintest hint of a smile to appear before quietly saying, "Then maybe you should verify it." The faint smile on Marcus Reed's face disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind the same calm expression he had worn all morning. Across the courtroom, uncertainty spread like a shadow. Moments earlier, many of the spectators had been amused. Now they were simply curious. Officer Derek Vaughn still held the identification holder in his hand, but the confidence he had displayed so freely was beginning to crack. Not because he believed Marcus yet, but because Marcus seemed completely unconcerned about what happened next. Most people carrying a questionable credential would become nervous when challenged. Marcus looked almost relieved. Judge Eleanor Whitmore leaned slightly forward. The courtroom had drifted far from the original proceedings, and everyone knew it. Even the attorneys had stopped pretending to focus on their notes. Every eye remained fixed on the small credential holder resting in Derek's hand. The judge finally broke the silence. "Officer Vaughn," she said evenly, "bring that document forward." Derek hesitated for half a second before walking toward the bench. The hesitation did not go unnoticed. Sarah Bennett noticed it immediately. So did several reporters seated nearby. Derek handed over the credential. Judge Whitmore examined it carefully. Her expression revealed nothing. She studied the photograph. The identification number. The federal markings. Then she placed it beside the sealed folder that had been delivered earlier that morning. That small movement caught Marcus's attention. It also caught Sarah's. The reporter felt her pulse quicken. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than anyone had realized. "Your Honor," Derek said, attempting to regain control of the situation, "I strongly believe this identification is not authentic." Judge Whitmore looked at him calmly. "And what specifically leads you to that conclusion?" The question seemed simple, yet Derek struggled to answer immediately. "Because it does not make sense," he finally replied. "He showed up alone. He has no legal representation. He has not identified himself. He has spent the entire morning sitting here watching everything." The judge remained silent. Derek continued. "If he were actually who this credential claims he is, none of this would make sense." Several spectators nodded in agreement. It sounded reasonable. At least on the surface. Judge Whitmore turned her attention toward Marcus. "Would you like to respond?" Marcus stood slowly. The room became completely still. "No, Your Honor," he said. A ripple of confusion passed through the gallery. Sarah lowered her pen. Even Derek looked surprised. Most people would have rushed to defend themselves. Marcus did the opposite. "No?" the judge asked. "No, ma'am," Marcus replied. "I would prefer the facts speak for themselves." The statement landed with unexpected weight. It was not confrontational. It was not emotional. Yet somehow it changed the atmosphere of the room. Judge Whitmore glanced down at the credential one more time before looking toward the court clerk. "Contact the appropriate federal office and verify the identification number." A collective silence swept across the courtroom. The clerk immediately reached for the phone. Derek shifted his weight uneasily. Sarah could hear the faint sound of pages turning as reporters prepared their notebooks. Marcus simply returned to his seat. Then something unexpected happened. As the clerk began dialing, Judge Whitmore opened the sealed folder once again. Her eyes moved across the first page. This time her expression changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. For the first time all day, the judge looked directly at Marcus Reed, not as an observer, not as a stranger, but as someone whose presence in that courtroom had been anticipated long before the doors ever opened that morning. The wait felt longer than it actually was. In reality, only a few minutes passed as the court clerk remained on the phone, quietly speaking with officials hundreds of miles away. Yet inside the courtroom, every second seemed stretched thin. Nobody returned to their conversations. Nobody checked their phones. Even the attorneys sat motionless, watching the process unfold. The ordinary rhythm of the courthouse had disappeared. Something important was happening, and everyone could feel it. Marcus Reed sat calmly with his hands folded. He did not glance toward the clerk. He did not look toward Officer Derek Vaughn. He simply waited. The confidence he carried was not the confidence of someone hoping to be proven right. It was the confidence of someone who already knew the answer. Across the room, Derek attempted to maintain his composure. He stood near the prosecution table with his arms crossed, but subtle signs of tension were beginning to appear. His jaw tightened. His shoulders shifted. Every few moments he glanced toward the clerk, as if expecting the verification call to end in his favor. After all, he had built his entire morning around one assumption. The assumption that Marcus Reed was pretending to be something he was not. If that assumption collapsed, so would everything that followed it. Sarah Bennett watched the scene closely from her seat. Her notebook remained open, but she had stopped writing. Experience had taught her that some moments were too important to interrupt with notes. This felt like one of those moments. Near the bench, Judge Eleanor Whitmore quietly reviewed the contents of the sealed folder once more. The documents inside appeared ordinary from a distance, yet each page seemed to deepen her focus. Occasionally her eyes lifted toward Marcus. Each time, the expression on her face became more thoughtful. The courtroom clock ticked forward. Then finally the clerk lowered the phone. The simple movement immediately captured everyone's attention. A silence settled over the room so complete that the faint hum of the overhead lights became noticeable. The clerk stood and approached the bench. She handed a written note to Judge Whitmore. The judge read it carefully. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. Derek stared at the bench. Marcus remained still. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. Judge Whitmore finished reading the note and placed it beside the credential. For a brief moment, she said nothing. The pause seemed endless. Then she looked directly toward Marcus Reed. "Mr. Reed," she said. "The identification has been verified." A wave of shock moved through the courtroom. Several spectators exchanged stunned looks. One attorney nearly dropped his pen. Sarah immediately began writing again. Derek did not react at first. It was as if the words had not fully reached him. Verified. The credential was authentic. The federal identification was real. The man he had spent the entire morning dismissing was exactly who he claimed to be. Yet the surprise did not end there. Judge Whitmore continued speaking. Federal authorities have confirmed not only the validity of the credential, but also Mr. Reed's current assignment status. The room grew silent again. Marcus finally looked up. The judge met his gaze. Something passed between them, something that suggested this story had begun long before anyone else realized. Derek's confidence faded completely as uncertainty settled across his face. Because for the first time all day, he was no longer asking who Marcus Reed was. He was beginning to wonder why Marcus Reed had chosen to be there in the first place. The words settled over the courtroom like a sudden change in weather. Verified. Current assignment status confirmed. Yet the question hanging over every person in the room remained unanswered. Why was Marcus Reed there? Judge Eleanor Whitmore allowed the silence to linger before opening the sealed folder once again. This time she removed several documents and placed them neatly on the bench. The movement immediately drew attention. Reporters leaned forward. Attorneys exchanged nervous glances. Even members of the gallery who had arrived expecting an ordinary hearing now sensed they were witnessing something far more significant. Marcus remained seated. His expression did not change. Across the room, Officer Derek Vaughn felt the atmosphere shifting in a direction he could no longer control. For hours he had been the loudest voice in the room. Now he was struggling to understand a story that seemed to be unfolding around him without his participation. Judge Whitmore looked toward Marcus. "Mr. Reed, federal authorities have confirmed your identity and your position." Marcus gave a small nod. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge paused. "They have also confirmed that your presence here today is directly connected to an ongoing federal investigation." A collective gasp moved through the gallery. Sarah Bennett stopped writing for a moment. Around her, people exchanged stunned looks. Federal investigation. The phrase carried weight. Suddenly every interaction from earlier that morning appeared different. Every question. Every comment. Every decision. Derek straightened immediately. "Investigation?" he asked. "What investigation?" Judge Whitmore did not answer him right away. Instead, she reviewed one final page from the folder before speaking. "The details remain confidential," she said carefully. "However, I have been authorized to acknowledge that Mr. Reed has been operating as part of a multi-agency task force reviewing allegations of misconduct, abuse of authority, evidence irregularities, and procedural violations involving multiple departments." The room fell silent again. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of realization. People were beginning to connect the pieces. Sarah felt it before anyone said a word. She looked toward Derek. Then toward Marcus. Then back toward the folder. Her pulse quickened. Derek noticed the same thing. For the first time all day, genuine concern appeared on his face. "Are you saying I am under investigation?" he asked. Marcus finally stood. Every eye followed him. The room seemed smaller now. Quieter. More focused. "I am saying," Marcus replied calmly, "that some questions require answers." The simplicity of the statement made it even more powerful. He was not making accusations. He was not celebrating. He was stating a fact. Judge Whitmore folded her hands. "Officer Vaughn, nobody in this courtroom has been declared guilty of anything." Relief briefly crossed Derek's face. Then the judge continued. "But Mr. Reed's assignment was approved months ago, and this courthouse was designated as an observation site as part of the review process." Sarah felt her breath catch. Months ago. That meant Marcus had not arrived by coincidence. He had not wandered into the courtroom. He had been exactly where he was supposed to be. Every word spoken around him. Every decision made in front of him. Every assumption made about him. Someone had been paying attention the entire time. And suddenly the question was no longer who Marcus Reed was. The question everyone wanted answered now was how much he had already seen. The realization spread through the courtroom one person at a time. Some people looked stunned. Others looked uneasy. A few simply stared at Marcus Reed as though seeing him for the first time. Yet Marcus himself had not changed. He was still the same quiet man who had walked through the courthouse doors that morning without announcing who he was. The difference was that now everyone understood there had been a reason for his silence. Judge Eleanor Whitmore carefully closed the folder and placed both hands on the bench. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Earlier, the room had treated Marcus like an outsider. Now nobody seemed willing to look away from him. Officer Derek Vaughn stood motionless near the prosecution table. The confidence that had once filled his voice had disappeared. In its place was uncertainty. For the first time all day, he seemed aware that every decision he had made that morning might be viewed through a very different lens. Before anyone could speak, the courtroom doors opened once again. Several officials entered quietly and took seats along the side wall. They wore business attire rather than uniforms, but their arrival immediately drew attention. Sarah Bennett recognized one of them from previous federal proceedings. Her eyes widened. She quickly began taking notes. The room grew even quieter. Judge Whitmore acknowledged the new arrivals with a brief nod. No introductions were offered. None were necessary. Their presence alone spoke volumes. Marcus glanced toward them and then returned his attention to the bench. It was a small gesture, but Sarah noticed something important. He did not appear surprised to see them. In fact, he looked as though he had expected them all along. The realization sent a chill through her. How much of this had been planned? How long had this process been underway? Judge Whitmore cleared her throat. The court has received confirmation regarding several procedural matters connected to the ongoing review process. The statement sounded formal, but its impact was immediate. Several attorneys exchanged nervous glances. Derek looked toward the federal representatives. One of them quietly opened a folder and reviewed several pages. Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. The silence itself felt heavy. Then the judge continued. Certain administrative actions will be taking place following today's proceedings. Again, she chose her words carefully. No accusations. No dramatic declarations. Just facts. Yet those facts carried enormous weight. Sarah could almost feel the story taking shape in front of her. Not because someone had been publicly exposed. Not because anyone had been humiliated. But because truth was gradually replacing assumption. The entire morning had been built upon appearances. People had assumed they knew who Marcus Reed was. They had assumed they understood why he was there. They had assumed they knew who mattered and who did not. Every one of those assumptions had been wrong. Across the courtroom, Derek slowly lowered his eyes. For hours he had focused on Marcus. Now he seemed focused on himself. On the decisions he had made. On the words he had chosen. On the conclusions he had reached before knowing the facts. Marcus remained calm. He did not celebrate. He did not react. He simply watched as the room came to understand a lesson he had already known from the beginning. Respect is easy when authority is visible. Character is revealed when authority remains hidden. The courthouse felt different by the time the afternoon light began filtering through the tall windows. The tension that had dominated the room for hours had slowly given way to reflection. People who had arrived expecting a routine hearing now sat quietly, thinking about everything they had witnessed. Judge Eleanor Whitmore reviewed her final notes before bringing the proceedings to a close. The federal representatives remained seated along the side wall, speaking only occasionally among themselves. Reporters organized pages of notes. Attorneys packed briefcases. Yet nobody seemed eager to leave. There was a sense that something important had happened, even if not everyone fully understood it yet. Marcus Reed stood near the back of the courtroom exactly where he had spent most of the day. He had not demanded recognition. He had not delivered a dramatic speech. He had not tried to embarrass anyone. Instead, he had allowed the truth to reveal itself one step at a time. Across the room, Officer Derek Vaughn remained unusually quiet. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier that morning was gone. In its place was something far more uncomfortable. Self-awareness. For the first time, he appeared to be replaying the day's events through a different lens. Not from his own perspective, but from the perspective of the man he had judged before knowing anything about him. As people began standing to leave, Derek slowly approached Marcus. Several nearby spectators noticed and paused to watch. Sarah Bennett lowered her notebook one final time. The room became still once more. Derek looked at Marcus for a long moment before speaking. I had been asking the wrong question all day, he admitted quietly. Marcus said nothing. Derek exhaled. I kept asking who you were. He glanced around the courtroom. I should have been asking how I treated someone before I knew who they were. The honesty of the statement surprised everyone nearby. Marcus studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. That question matters more. Derek looked down briefly. Why did you not tell me from the beginning? The answer came without hesitation. Because respect should not depend on a title, a badge, or a position. The words settled over the room. Simple. Calm. Impossible to ignore. Marcus continued. People show their character long before they learn someone is important. Nobody spoke. They did not need to. The lesson was already clear. Judge Whitmore watched from the bench with a thoughtful expression. Sarah quietly wrote one final sentence in her notebook. It would later become the headline of her story. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Marcus collected his belongings and walked toward the exit. No applause followed him. No celebration waited outside. He seemed perfectly comfortable with that. Some victories do not require attention. Some truths speak loudly enough on their own. The doors closed behind him, and the room remained silent for several seconds afterward. In the end, the most important thing revealed that day was not a federal credential, an assignment, or an investigation. It was a reminder that dignity should never have to be earned through status. Because the people who deserve respect are not only those with power. They are the ones who offer respect before they know who stands in front of them.